Hello, everybody. My name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today, we're going to be discussing Joel Webbon's video talking about postmillennials and how it's inconsistent for them to take a futurist view of Romans 11, not Romans 13, without really falling into much of the same criticisms that he would have, and certainly I would share for dispensationalism. So, this is a very interesting topic. It's definitely one that I've thought about a lot. I wrestle with Romans 11 because I think it's a more difficult text, and it's also hard to reconcile with Paul's other writings. And Joel Webbon believes that the solution to this text is that it's a futurist view from Paul's perspective, but a past view from our own perspective, believing that it was in the future that Paul's referring to because it was written in 8050, 8052, somewhere around that range is my impression of when the book of Romans was written. So this is a very, I guess, more of a conversational episode because this is something that I wrestle with, and I've definitely been having a lot of questions, about how a lot of evangelical assumptions, although not exclusively evangelical. I know some very dispensationalist Catholics, if you know what I'm saying, in real life, by the way. So, with that said, my journey comes from, asking questions about things that don't make sense. And that's just kind of what happens when you have a discerning mind. And apparently, I'm not alone in asking much of the same questions. Joel Webbon has been asking these same questions. JD Hall has been asking much of these same questions as well. So, they're both very helpful in advancing this conversation because I do think people who are not Zionists need to be prepared to wrestle with Romans 11, and I think Joel Webbon is definitely helping to advance that conversation by arguing for the futurist position, which is a historically minority position, but I do believe that the preterist position is the historically minority position, but it makes more sense than the futurist position. Just looking at the situation as a whole. So we're going to dive into this, but first I want you to know Evangelical Dark Web is a Christian news gathering and commentary ministry. You can support our work over at Patreon-like system at evangelicaldarkweb.org, which goes to paying some writers, including our friend Defiant Baptist who clipped this, uh, because I had not gotten to this part in the series that Joel Webbon is doing with Stephen Wolfe on Christian nationalism. So I haven't gotten to this part in the series yet. So you can support our Patreon-like system. We also have a free newsletter. But the least you can do is like this video, subscribe to the channel, to the podcast if you're new. So this is a clip from, again, recent episode that he did with Stephen Wolfe that, became more behind, in front of the paywall. I believe it started out behind the paywall. So, here we go.
Part of what landed me on hard supersessionism as my position with Romans 11 is first and foremost the God-breathed text. I really feel like it makes that hermeneutic applied to Galatians, applied to the book of Hebrews, is integral. The whole book, the whole book of Hebrews, the book of Galatians, and then also Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11. Those would be some of the key texts, and Ephesians. That hermeneutic seems to be the most consistent, and has the most just the best way of resolving all those texts in a consistent manner for me.
So this is something that I believe is a challenge, is the fact that the futurist view of Romans 11 does not really mesh well with Galatians. And he also brought up the book of Hebrews and the book of Ephesians, as well as, how do you wrestle Romans 11 with Romans 9, which is really about the doctrine of election. So that's kind of what Romans speaks to. Romans is a book that speaks more about soteriology, uh, and that's how you reconcile that with James, which is a book that's far more practical about sanctification. So both are about salvation and being saved, but they focus on different aspects of the God's plan for saving souls. So I'll let him continue.
So the exegesis persuaded me. Beyond that, so that's number one. I really was persuaded, I think, by the Word of God. But secondly, one of the things that persuaded me is, even if you're not a dispensationalist and you don't think there's any future land promises, physical promises for Israel, by simply holding to a future, in our future, and Paul's future, because I date, the writing of Romans probably like 80, 50, 80, 55. So it was in Paul's future, 80, 70. But if you think it's in our future, that Romans 11 is indicating a future, not land promises, not physical, but a spiritual revival for Israel. Not in Paul's future, 20 years down the line, but still in our future, then one of the things that has to happen, especially, and here's, see, for you can get out of this as an all-mill guy, but for some of the post-mill guys, especially the ones who are...
Just to state my eschatological position, I would lean more towards amillennial, maybe more of an optimistic amillennial, but uh, the optimistic, pessimistic doesn't necessarily matter for my position, but I definitely lean more towards an amillennial perspective, and that is based on my view of the millennium.
Like, it'll be 50,000 years before Christ returns. Think about this logically. If you're a long game post-mill guy, but you're also like, there's a spiritual revival for Israel, and a lot of these guys hold to like a David Chilton golden age, and they think the golden age comes right after. Right? So it's right at the end, before the final physical return of Christ, and right after this revival, spiritual revival among the Jews. And a lot of them think that it'll be about 1,000 years, but they think that we've got a 50,000 year timeline. So think about this logically. We're 2,000 years in, 50,000 years is the timeline, and the Jews are going to get saved with this revival right before the last 1,000 years. That means we have, if my math is right, 47,000 years between today and the future spiritual revival of the Jews. And even if there's not a physical land promise, and it's just a spiritual revival promise, well, one thing that has to happen for that spiritual revival promise to be fulfilled is they have to at least survive.
Yeah, right.
So for 47,000
no
years,
intermarriage.
Western Christian nations, with whether, alliances, military, keeping them out of war, no intermarriage, like kinism for thee, but not for me. At every single level, and
you basically have to grant, special privilege.
Yes, you have to give them special privilege.
Yeah, and
even if you only think it's a spiritual revival. Whereas like me and Isker, we both take the approach that I already espoused with the partial and so me and Isker, what it allows us to do is, it doesn't require us to have any animosity or malice.
I wanted to kind of interject because, Stephen Wolf is trying to get a word in, and Joel Webbon, my man, you have a guest on your podcast, but, they sometimes get to speak. I'm just kidding, but he knows that's a running joke at his expense, that he knows is out there and fully kind of embraces and laughs at. But it definitely showcased itself on this occasion.
Or hatred or anything like that, but it also allows us to be like, you're not special at all. At all. You're not less special, but not at all. And here's the thing: even the guys who are like, well, Joel, that's you're talking to me like I'm dispensational. You're talking to me like I'm a Zionist. It's like, well, brother, I know you're not dispensational. I understand your covenantal. I understand your Westminster, federalism and blah blah blah. I get it. Good for you. But here's what even you with your position still require: their survival.
So it's like a functional dispensationalism.
It is.
So that is the clip. And, I think part of it was maybe there's a reference to Doug Wilson in that video. Let me just show you this tweet, because, Doug Wilson did come out and say to this clip being posted on social media, even though he's not mentioned in this clip at all, emphasis on the at all, because Doug Wilson would say, except that I'm not a Zionist at all. Well, if you're not, then why did you respond? Because if he wasn't talking about you, then, why respond at all? So I thought that was pretty interesting. But what's interesting about the point about survival is that, historically speaking, it's very hard for a a distinct race of people to not undergo some form of changes or splitting off and stuff like that over the course of thousands and thousands of years. So, yeah, for the assumption that the Jews are going to be that race that does that, well, first of all, good luck, especially without a distinct homeland for at least some of those thousand years. And second of all, they already kind of have not done that. Ashkenazi Jews, and this is one of the questions that I just asked myself, is if they are descendants of Abraham, why are they calling themselves Ashkenazi, which is a reference to Ashkenaz, who's a descendant of Japheth? That's clearly an indication that these people are not descended from Abraham or Shem, but they're descended from Japheth and Ashkenaz instead. Well, good question. But as it would turn out, Ashkenazis are the most researched and debated genealogy of all time. And I don't think there's a close second unless you want to get into Sephardic Jews. So, like, number one and number two would be those two, would be the most debated genealogies of all time. However, despite the debates that, struggle to consistently find uh, connection to the Middle East of antiquity, uh, there is far less debate over, actually modern day Palestinians actually would boast far more, Palestinian Christians especially would boast far more of a genealogical connection to ancient Israelites. So that is what we learn from doing genealogy studies, that the Ashkenazis, very debatable. Maybe they have a connection in there. I think they tend to be the descendants uh, of converts to Judaism. But before, some people say Khazars. I think they're before the Khazars. So not sure what century, but I I want to say post 70 80, but way before the Khazars. So that would be my guess, because I've seen some studies that suggest that. Specifically, like they did like a geo study of like Yiddish speakers, and it found northern Anatolia was where they were genetically Jew pinned. So anyway, that's my take on that. What exactly would be Paul's take? Paul boasted his credentials as being a member of the tribe of Benjamin, which was, for all intents and purposes, a kind of lost tribe. And then also, he's a Pharisee of Pharisees. Would he consider modern Jews to be Jewish by Paul's standard, and certainly of the standards of that culture? If Sumerians were not, or the Samaritans were not Jewish enough, why would the Ashkenazis be? If the Hellenistic Jews were not Jewish enough, why would modern ones be? So these are questions that need to be asked. And it was J.D. Hall who kind of, brought up these points that, hey, Paul would not consider these people to be his countrymen. And why would he? They don't have a shared religion. They have a very dubious lineage. It's not pure. Uh, and nevertheless, there's a lot of other stuff. Netanyahu being, having a Polish name and stuff like that. So all of these things add up to where it really seems illogical for Romans 11 to be futurist. So those are my thoughts on that. Joel Webbon, I thought, that was a pretty good clip for him, I think. Again, being very reasonable about these assumptions. And as someone who's not post-millennial, yeah, I don't have to struggle with wrestling post-millennialism to, and, not being a Zionist shill. I don't have to struggle with that. So anyway, so that's more fun for me. But I think this is the conversation that needs to be had. Who does Romans 11 apply to? Those who are genetic descendants of Jacob? Those who identify as descendants of Jacob? Or do they need both? And if you have a futurist position of Romans 11, you need to answer that question in order to have an argument, an exegesis that makes sense. Who is it referring to? The genetic, the identifiers, or both are required? You have to genetic and you have to identify. Because I don't think it applies to people who are not genetically descended. And so that, to me, I would say the steel man position is genetic. But who is most genetically descended? Not the Ashkenazis. So those are my thoughts on this issue. Hope that advances the discourse as we wrestle through the truth of Scripture together. And, that's all I got to say about that for now. Stay based, Christ is King, and we will catch you on the next one.